The coffee shop on 5th Street was buzzing with its usual Tuesday afternoon crowd when Marcus said those 3 words that would change everything between us. We were sitting in our regular corner booth, the one by the window where the afternoon sun always hit just right, making his brown eyes look almost golden. I had been telling him about the promotion I'd finally gotten at the marketing firm downtown, expecting him to be as excited as I was. Instead, he stirred his coffee slowly and looked at me with that distant expression I'd been seeing more often lately. "Emma, you know we're just friends, right?" The words hung in the air between us like smoke from his untouched cigarette. I felt my stomach drop, not because I hadn't suspected this conversation was coming, but because hearing it spoken aloud made it undeniably real. We had been practically inseparable for 3 years. 3 years of late-night phone calls when he couldn't sleep after his father's accident. 3 years of weekend road trips to the lake house his family owned upstate. 3 years of birthdays spent curled up on my couch, watching old movies and sharing takeout from that Thai place on Elm Street. I had let myself believe we were building something real. The way he'd hold my hand during scary movies, how he'd show up at my apartment with soup when I was sick, the inside jokes that made us laugh until our sides hurt. But sitting there in that coffee shop, watching him avoid my eyes, I realized I had been writing a love story while he was just living his life. "Of course," I managed to say, forcing a smile that felt like it might crack my face in half. "I know that." But I didn't cry. Not then. Not in front of him. I nodded slowly and gave him the kind of smile you give someone when you're trying to be brave for both of you. Inside, though, something fundamental shifted. It was like a door closing quietly, but with finality. If I was only a friend to Marcus, then I would act like one. No more staying up until 2 a.m, listening to him talk about his problems with work or his complicated relationship with his mother. No more planning my weekends around his schedule, or hoping that maybe this time, when we went to dinner, he'd finally see me the way I saw him. The walk back to my apartment felt longer than usual. The familiar streets of downtown Portland seemed different somehow, like I was seeing them through new eyes. I passed the bookstore where we'd spent countless Saturday afternoons browsing through the used book section, and the little park where we'd had picnics last summer. Everything held memories now, but they felt different, less precious, more like artifacts from a time I needed to let go. That night, I sat on my fire escape with a glass of wine and really thought about it. For 3 years, I had been giving Marcus all the emotional benefits of a relationship without any of the commitment or reciprocation. I was always available when he needed someone to talk to, always ready to drop my plans if he wanted to hang out, always hoping that if I was patient enough and understanding enough, he would eventually realize what we could be together. There was an odd freedom in finally accepting the truth. Letting go of those expectations gave me room to breathe for the first time in months. I stopped analyzing every text message he sent, stopped waiting for him to call, stopped checking my phone every 5 minutes hoping to see his name. Instead, I focused on myself. I started going to yoga classes again, something I'd stopped doing because it conflicted with our usual Wednesday movie nights. I called my sister Sarah more often, rebuilding connections I'd let slide while I was so focused on Marcus. The next few weeks were strange. Marcus would still try to call me late at night, his voice heavy with whatever stress was keeping him awake. But instead of talking for hours like we used to, I kept the conversation short and practical. When he asked if I wanted to grab dinner at our usual spot, I politely declined and suggested we meet for coffee instead, somewhere public and time-limited. He seemed confused by the change, but I didn't owe him an explanation. I had already given him 3 years of explanations for why I was always available, always understanding, always there. I didn't stop caring about Marcus. That would have been impossible after all we'd shared. But I stopped hoping for something more, and that made all the difference. It was like finally putting down a heavy bag I'd been carrying for miles, without realizing how much it was weighing me down. My shoulders relaxed, my steps felt lighter, and for the first time in years, I started to remember who I was when I wasn't trying to be what someone else needed. Adjusting to our new dynamic turned out to be easier than I'd expected. Once I stopped giving Marcus the emotional intimacy of a relationship without the title, I began to see just how one-sided things had really been. He would still show up at my apartment on Friday nights with Chinese takeout and that expectant smile, the way he had for years. But now I'd already have plans. Sometimes it was true. yoga class, or dinner with Sarah. Sometimes I just wanted to stay home alone and read a book without feeling guilty about it. The confusion in his eyes was almost comical. He'd stand there in my doorway, holding containers of lo mein and sweet and sour chicken, clearly not understanding why I wasn't automatically available anymore. "Rain check?" I'd say cheerfully, and close the door before he could argue. It felt good to have boundaries again. Marcus tried different approaches. He'd text me funny memes at work, hoping to start long conversations like we used to have. I'd respond with a simple laugh emoji and nothing more. He'd call on his lunch breaks, seemingly just to chat, but I'd tell him I was busy and couldn't talk, which was usually true. I'd started actually taking lunch breaks instead of eating at my desk while talking to him. The most telling moment came on a Thursday evening in late October. I was walking out of my favorite bookstore on 23rd Avenue, arms full of new novels I was excited to read, when Marcus appeared seemingly out of nowhere. He fell into step beside me like we'd planned to meet, chatting about his day as if nothing had changed between us. "Want to grab a drink?" he asked as we reached the corner where our paths usually diverged. That new craft brewery opened up on Division. I heard they have amazing IPAs. "Thanks, but I'm heading home," I said, shifting my books to one arm so I could check my phone. "Early morning tomorrow." "Come on, Em," he said. And I noticed he used the nickname he'd given me years ago, the one that used to make my heart skip. Just one drink. We haven't hung out properly in weeks. That's when it hit me. He genuinely didn't understand what had changed. In his mind, we were still the same friends we'd always been, and I was just being difficult or going through some kind of phase. He had no idea that I'd spent the last month and a half learning to live without the constant hope that he might suddenly see me differently. "We hung out last week," I reminded him. "Coffee, remember? That was different. That was just..." He gestured vaguely, clearly struggling to articulate what he meant. "That was just coffee." "Right," I said, "because we're just friends." Using his own words seemed to sting. He opened his mouth like he wanted to argue, then closed it again. I used the moment of silence to say goodbye and head toward my apartment. That weekend, I ran into David at Kelly's housewarming party in Southeast Portland. David Chen, Marcus's younger brother. I'd met him plenty of times over the years. Family barbecues, birthday parties, holiday gatherings where I'd been Marcus's inevitable +1. But somehow I'd never really seen him before. Not the way I saw him that night. While everyone else was crowded around the kitchen island doing shots and telling loud stories, David was sitting on Kelly's back porch, quietly observing the party through the sliding glass door. He had a book in his lap, something by Haruki Murakami, and was nursing a beer that looked mostly untouched. "Not much of a party person?" I asked, settling into the chair next to him. He looked up, surprised, then smiled. It was a quieter smile than Marcus's, less performative, more genuine. "Not really. You?" "I used to think I was," I said, surprising myself with the honesty. "But lately I'm discovering I actually prefer quieter evenings." We talked for 2 hours. Not about Marcus, not about our shared history through him, but about books and travel and the documentary about urban beekeeping that David was working on for a local production company. He was a freelance videographer, something I'd never known despite years of being around his family. He'd spent 6 months in Japan the previous year, filming a project about traditional pottery makers. His stories were fascinating, but what struck me most was how he listened, really listened, when I talked about my work or my thoughts on the books I'd been reading. When the party started winding down around midnight, David offered to walk me to my car. The October air was crisp, and fallen leaves crunched under our feet as we walked down Kelly's tree-lined street. "This was nice," he said when we reached my Honda Civic. "I mean, talking with you. I never really got the chance before." "I know what you mean," I said, and I did. At family gatherings, I'd always been focused on Marcus, on being the supportive friend, on fitting into the role he'd created for me in his life. I'd never taken the time to really notice David, to see him as his own person, rather than just Marcus's younger brother. "Maybe we could grab coffee sometime," David said, then quickly added, "I mean, if you want to. No pressure." The careful way he phrased it, asking, not assuming, made something warm unfurl in my chest. "I'd like that," I said, and meant it. Driving home that night, I realized I'd gone an entire evening without thinking about Marcus once. It felt like waking up from a long, confusing dream. David texted me 3 days later, asking if I wanted to meet at Stumptown Coffee on Wednesday afternoon. No games, no last-minute invitations, no assumptions that I'd automatically be free. Just a simple, straightforward invitation that I could accept or decline without drama. I said yes. He was already there when I arrived, sitting at a small table near the window with 2 cups in front of him. "I got you a cortado," he said, standing up as I approached. "But if you don't like it, I can get you something else." The gesture was small, but thoughtful. Marcus had never learned my coffee order despite 3 years of friendship. He'd always just gotten what he wanted and assumed I'd figure out my own drink. "Cortado's perfect," I said, settling into the chair across from David. "How did you know?" "Lucky guess," he said with that quiet smile. "You seem like someone who appreciates balance." We talked easily, picking up the conversation from Kelly's party as if only minutes had passed instead of days. David told me about the documentary he was editing, about the elderly Japanese potter who'd spent 60 years perfecting his technique. I found myself leaning forward, genuinely interested in his stories, asking questions not to be polite, but because I wanted to know more. "Want to take a walk?" he suggested after we'd finished our coffee. "There's this small park a few blocks from here. Nothing fancy, but it's nice." Laurelhurst Park was quiet in the late afternoon, with joggers on the paths and dog owners scattered across the grass. We walked slowly, our conversation meandering like the trail we followed. When we passed a street musician playing guitar, badly, near the pond, we both started laughing at the same time. "Should we tip him to stop?" David whispered, making me laugh harder. "That seems mean," I whispered back. "Maybe tip him to take lessons?" It was such a silly moment, but it felt natural. Easy. I realized I'd been smiling more in the past 2 hours than I had in weeks. Our coffee dates became a regular thing. Every Wednesday at first, then Saturdays too, then whenever we both had free time. David would suggest things. A new exhibit at the art museum, a farmer's market on the east side, a bookstore reading by an author we both liked. Never anything that felt like pressure, never anything that made me feel like I owed him something in return. One rainy Saturday in November, we ended up at Powell's Books, wandering the maze of shelves and reading passages aloud to each other. David found a collection of Japanese poetry and read me a haiku about autumn rain that was so beautiful it gave me chills. I discovered a cookbook full of one-pot meals and jokingly offered to test recipes on him. "I'd like that," he said, and something in his voice made me look up from the book. His expression was serious, hopeful in a way that made my heart skip. "I mean, if you want to cook together sometime. I make decent sous chef, according to my mom." "Your mom might be biased," I said, but I was smiling. "Probably," he agreed. "Want to find out for yourself?" The following Sunday, David came over to my apartment with a bag of groceries and a bottle of wine. We decided to attempt coq au vin, despite neither of us having made it before. The cooking process was chaotic. David accidentally added too much salt. I nearly burned the mushrooms, and we couldn't figure out if the chicken was supposed to look quite so pale. But we laughed through all of it. When David reached across me to grab the wine opener, his hand brushed mine, and neither of us moved away immediately. When I stretched up to get plates from the high cabinet, he steadied me with a gentle hand on my back. Small touches, natural moments that didn't feel calculated or desperate. The coq au vin turned out surprisingly edible, and we ate it on my couch while watching a French film David had recommended. Somewhere during the second act, he reached over and took my hand. Not dramatically, not with fanfare, just a quiet gesture that felt right. I didn't flinch. I didn't compare it to holding Marcus's hand during scary movies. I didn't analyze what it meant or where it might lead. It just felt good, warm and comfortable and honest. "Is this okay?" David asked softly, threading his fingers through mine. "Yeah," I said. "It's okay." When he kissed me later, as the credits rolled on the movie, it was gentle and unhurried. There was no desperation in it, no sense that this was my only chance to prove something or win someone over. It was just David, and it was just me, and it was something that felt like it was happening because we both wanted it to, not because one of us was trying to convince the other. Afterward, we sat together in comfortable silence, my head on his shoulder, his arm around me. The rain continued pattering against my windows, and the apartment felt warm and safe and full of possibility. "I really like you, Emma," David said quietly. "I hope you know that." "I really like you too," I said. And for the first time in years, I wasn't worried about what would happen next. I wasn't calculating my response or wondering if I was saying the right thing. I was just being honest about how I felt, with someone who seemed to genuinely want to know. David and I had been seeing each other for about a month when Marcus found out. We hadn't been hiding it exactly, but we hadn't announced it either. It felt too new, too precious to expose to other people's opinions and questions. We were still figuring out what we were to each other, still learning the rhythm of being together. The news reached Marcus through Jenny, a mutual friend who'd seen us at Saturday Market holding hands and sharing a cinnamon roll from that vendor David loved. In Portland's tight-knit circles, especially among people in their late 20s who'd all known each other since college, gossip traveled fast. By Sunday evening, my phone was buzzing with a text from Marcus. "Seriously? My brother?" I stared at the screen for a long moment, sitting in my kitchen with a cup of tea getting cold in my hands. David had left an hour earlier after we'd spent the afternoon watching old movies and debating whether Casablanca was actually romantic or just manipulative. My apartment still smelled like the pizza we'd ordered, and I could see his jacket draped over my couch where he'd forgotten it. The whole scene felt so normal, so right, that Marcus's text seemed to come from another world entirely. "Yes," I texted back. Simple, honest, unapologetic. My phone rang immediately. I let it go to voicemail, then listened to Marcus's message while I washed our pizza plates. His voice was tight with something that sounded like anger but felt more like wounded pride. "Emma, call me back. We need to talk about this. This is crazy. You can't just... he's my brother. Call me." I didn't call him back that night, or the next day, or the day after that. David and I had plans to go hiking at Mount Hood on Wednesday, and I wasn't going to let Marcus's reaction spoil something I was genuinely excited about. The confrontation came at Tom's birthday party the following weekend. I almost didn't go. I knew Marcus would be there, and I wasn't sure I was ready for the inevitable scene. But David convinced me that hiding would only make things worse. And besides, Tom was a good friend who deserved to have us there on his birthday. The party was at Tom's house in southeast Portland, the same craftsman bungalow where we'd celebrated his last 3 birthdays. The living room was packed with familiar faces, college friends, work colleagues, neighbors from the tight-knit community Tom had built around himself. I was talking with Sarah and her new girlfriend near the kitchen when Marcus appeared beside me. "Can we talk?" he said, not bothering with pleasantries. "Outside." I followed him to Tom's back deck, leaving Sarah looking concerned behind me. The October night was cold enough that I could see my breath, but Marcus seemed oblivious to the temperature. He was wearing just a thin sweater, his hands shoved deep in his pockets, his jaw tight with barely contained frustration. "How could you do this to me?" he asked as soon as we were alone. The question caught me off guard. "Do what to you?" "You know what. David, my brother." He ran a hand through his hair, a gesture I'd seen hundreds of times when he was stressed. Of all the guys in Portland, you had to pick him?" "I didn't pick anyone," I said, surprised by how calm my voice sounded. "It just happened." "It just happened?" Marcus's voice rose slightly. "Come on, Emma. You don't just accidentally start dating your best friend's brother. We're not best friends," I said quietly. "You made that very clear." That stopped him short. He stared at me for a moment, his mouth slightly open, like he'd forgotten his own words from that afternoon in the coffee shop 6 weeks ago. "That's not... I didn't mean..." he started, then stopped. "Look, that's different. That doesn't mean you can just move on to my family." "Actually, it does," I said, and I felt something solid and unshakable settle in my chest. "You told me we were just friends. You made it clear that I didn't mean anything more to you than shared time and convenience. So I acted like a friend. I moved on, and I fell for someone who actually sees me as more than just a comfortable habit." Marcus flinched like I'd slapped him. "I never said you were a habit. You didn't have to say it," I replied. 3 years, Marcus. 3 years of me being available whenever you needed someone to talk to, whenever you wanted company, whenever you needed someone to care about your problems. And the moment I stopped being available, you barely noticed, until I started dating someone else. That's not true, isn't it? I wrapped my arms around myself, suddenly feeling the cold. When's the last time you asked me how I was doing? Not as conversation filler, but because you actually wanted to know. When's the last time you did something just because you thought it would make me happy? He opened his mouth to answer, then closed it again. We both knew he couldn't think of an example. David asks about my day because he cares about the answer, I continued. He remembers things I tell him. He notices when I'm tired or stressed or excited about something. He sees me, Marcus. Really sees me. Not just as someone who's always going to be there no matter how little effort he puts in. So this is what? Revenge? Marcus's voice had gone cold now. Defensive. You're dating my brother to get back at me? No, I said, and I meant it completely. I'm dating your brother because he's kind and funny and talented and he treats me like someone worth his time. I'm dating him because when I'm with him, I don't feel like I'm trying to earn something I'm never going to get. Marcus was quiet for a long moment, staring out at Tom's dark backyard. When he finally spoke, his voice was smaller, more vulnerable than I'd heard it in months. I didn't know you felt that way. I know, I said, and for the first time since we'd come outside, I felt a flicker of sympathy for him. But that's the problem, isn't it? You never thought to ask. Through the sliding glass door, I could see David in the kitchen, talking with Tom, and gesturing animatedly about something. He must have sensed me watching, because he looked up and smiled, that quiet, genuine smile that had become so familiar. He didn't come outside to rescue me or insert himself into the conversation. He just smiled and went back to his story, trusting me to handle whatever I needed to handle. He's good for you, Marcus said quietly, following my gaze. I can see that. Yeah, I said. He is. Marcus nodded slowly, then looked at me one more time. I'm sorry, Emma, for not seeing it sooner, for not seeing you. I know, I said, but I'm not waiting anymore, Marcus. I'm not going to spend any more years hoping you'll figure out what you want. He nodded again, then walked back inside without another word. I stayed on the deck for a few more minutes, letting the cold air clear my head, then went back to the party. David was still in the kitchen, and when he saw me, he handed me a cup of hot cider without being asked. You okay? He said quietly. Yeah, I said, leaning into his warmth. I really am. After the confrontation at Tom's party, Marcus started reaching out more frequently. Text messages that began casually, asking about work or commenting on something funny he'd seen, but always seemed to be fishing for something deeper. Late-night calls that I let go to voicemail, listening the next morning to rambling messages where he talked around what he really wanted to say, invitations to coffee that arrived with increasing desperation as I politely declined each one. He's trying, David said one evening as we walked along the Willamette River. We'd made it a habit to take evening walks when the weather was decent, talking through our days and watching the city lights reflect on the water. Maybe he really does realize what he lost. I squeezed David's hand, grateful for his generosity even when talking about his own brother. Maybe he does, but that doesn't change anything for me. It was true. I had already done the hardest work, grieving the relationship that never was, accepting Marcus's limitations, and learning to build a life that didn't revolve around waiting for someone to choose me. I wasn't going to undo all that progress just because Marcus was finally experiencing what I'd felt for 3 years. The persistence was almost comical. Marcus would show up at the marketing firm's downtown office during my lunch break, claiming he just happened to be in the neighborhood. He'd text me articles he thought I'd find interesting, something he'd never done in all our years of friendship. He even sent flowers to my apartment once. Sunflowers, which were actually my favorite, though I was surprised he'd remembered. I gave the flowers to my elderly neighbor, Mrs. Patterson, who was delighted by the unexpected gift. Secret admirer? She asked with a wink. Something like that, I said. The most difficult moment came in early December. I was leaving my yoga class on a Tuesday evening when I found Marcus sitting in his car outside the studio. He got out when he saw me, his breath visible in the cold air, his hands shoved deep in his coat pockets. Can we please just talk? He asked. 5 minutes. That's all I'm asking. I was tired from class and hungry for the dinner David was cooking at my apartment. but something in Marcus's voice made me stop. He looked genuinely miserable, thinner than usual, with dark circles under his eyes that suggested he hadn't been sleeping well. 5 minutes, I agreed. We walked to a small coffee shop nearby, though it was too late for coffee and neither of us ordered anything. We sat across from each other at a small table by the window, and for a moment, neither of us spoke. "I've been thinking a lot," Marcus finally said, "about what you said at Tom's party, about how I never really saw you." "Marcus, no, let me finish," he said. "Please. You were right. About all of it. I took you for granted. I treated you like you'd always be there no matter what, and I never thought about what you might need from me." I could see the sincerity in his eyes, the genuine regret. Part of me, a very small part, felt vindicated. This was what I'd wanted to hear for so long. But mostly I just felt sad for both of us. "I appreciate you saying that," I said quietly. "I really do. But it doesn't change anything." "It could," he said quickly. "I mean, I know you're with David now, and I'm not asking you to. I'm not trying to break you up or anything. But maybe we could try again. As friends. Real friends this time." I studied his face, seeing the hope there, the genuine desire to fix what he'd broken. But I also saw something else, a kind of possessiveness that had nothing to do with love, and everything to do with not wanting to lose something that had always been his. "I don't think that's a good idea," I said gently. "Why not? I mean, we were friends for 3 years. That has to count for something." "We were never really friends, Marcus," I said, and the words felt both cruel and liberating. "I was in love with you, and you were comfortable with that arrangement, because it gave you everything you wanted without requiring anything from you. That's not friendship." He flinched, but I continued. "Real friendship is what I have with Sarah, or with Tom. It's mutual care and respect and genuine interest in each other's lives. It's not one person giving everything while the other person just takes. I did care about you," he protested. "I still do." "I know you do," I said, "but caring about someone and caring for them are different things. You cared about me the way you'd care about a favorite restaurant or a comfortable chair. You liked having me in your life because I made things easier for you." Marcus was quiet for a long moment, staring at his hands on the table. When he looked up, his eyes were bright with unshed tears. "I really did lose you, didn't I?" "You never had me," I said softly. "Not really. You had the version of me that was trying to earn your love, but you never knew the real me, because you never bothered to look. And David does?" I thought about David waiting for me at my apartment, probably timing the pasta so it would be ready when I got home. David, who'd noticed I was nervous about a big presentation at work and had left encouraging notes in my coffee cup and my purse and my car. David, who listened to my stories about difficult clients and remembered their names weeks later. "Yeah," I said. "He does." Marcus nodded slowly, like he was finally accepting something he'd been fighting against. "Are you happy?" he asked. "Very," I said, and meant it completely. He smiled then, and for the first time since this whole thing had started, it looked genuine. "Good. That's good." We sat in comfortable silence for a moment, and I realized this felt like closure, not the dramatic, emotional scene I might have imagined years ago, but something quieter and more real. "I should go," I said, standing up. "David's making dinner." "Yeah, of course." Marcus stood too, then hesitated. "Emma, I'm sorry. For all of it. For not seeing you, for taking so long to understand what I lost. You deserve better than I gave you." "I know," I said, and I found it. Walking back to my car, I felt lighter than I had in months. Not because Marcus had finally apologized, though that was nice, but because I realized I didn't need his apology anymore. I had already forgiven him, and more importantly, I had forgiven myself for all those years of hoping he would change. David was indeed timing the pasta when I got home, and my apartment smelled like garlic and basil, and something wonderful he was doing with mushrooms. He looked up when I came in, his face breaking into that smile that still made my heart skip. "How was yoga?" he asked, kissing my cheek. "Good," I said. "Really good." And it was. By spring, the drama had settled into memory. People stopped asking me awkward questions about dating David, stopped making comments about the complicated situation with Marcus. Portland's social circles adapted the way they always did, with initial gossip followed by gradual acceptance and eventual indifference. Life moved on, and so did I. David and I fell into rhythms that felt as natural as breathing. Saturday morning farmers markets where he'd buy ingredients for elaborate brunches I'd never have attempted on my own. Sunday afternoon hikes in the gorge, where he'd bring his camera and I'd bring books of poetry to read aloud at scenic overlooks. Weeknight dinners that turned into long conversations about everything and nothing, the kind of talks that made us look up in surprise to find it was past midnight. I met his parents properly at Easter dinner, not as Marcus's friend, but as David's girlfriend. His mother, Susan, was warm and welcoming in a way that felt genuine rather than polite. She asked about my work with real interest, remembered details from previous conversations, and insisted I call her by her first name. His father, quiet and thoughtful like David, showed me his woodworking shop in the garage and explained the intricacies of the dining table he was building. Marcus was there too, of course. It was unavoidably awkward for about 10 minutes, until David's youngest sister Rachel started telling stories about her semester studying abroad in Barcelona, and everyone got caught up in her adventures. I caught Marcus watching me once during dinner, but when our eyes met, he just nodded slightly and went back to his conversation with David's cousin about baseball. That went well, David said later as we drove back to my apartment. I was worried it might be weird. It was weird, I admitted, but good weird. Like we're all figuring out how to be adults about this. My family really likes you, he said. I mean, they liked you before, but this is different. Mom told me she's never seen me this happy. I reached over and squeezed his hand. Are you? Happy, I mean. Ridiculously, he said, bringing my hand to his lips and kissing my knuckles. Sometimes I can't believe this is real. I knew exactly what he meant. There was something almost surreal about being in a relationship where I didn't have to guess at the other person's feelings, didn't have to analyze every conversation for hidden meanings or signs of disinterest. David was remarkably straightforward. When he was happy, he showed it. When something bothered him, he talked about it. When he loved something I cooked, or a book I recommended, or a joke I made, he said so. The ease of it had taken some getting used to. I'd spent so many years reading between lines that I'd forgotten how simple things could be when two people actually wanted to be together. In May, David got an assignment to film a documentary about urban farming initiatives across the Pacific Northwest. It would mean traveling for 6 weeks, visiting Seattle, Bellingham, Vancouver, and several smaller cities. He was excited about the project, but worried about leaving me. It's only 6 weeks, I told him, as we walked through Laurelhurst Park, the same route we'd taken on our first real date months ago. I'll be here when you get back. I know, but we've never been apart for more than a few days, he said. What if you realize you like having your space back? I stopped walking and turned to face him. David, I spent 3 years waiting for someone who was never really mine. I'm not going to forget what we have just because you're gone for a month and a half. He smiled, but I could see the insecurity lingering in his eyes. It occurred to me that maybe David had his own fears about relationships, his own reasons for being cautious. We'd been so focused on my baggage with Marcus that we'd never really talked about his romantic history. Have you ever been left before? I asked gently. He was quiet for a moment, then nodded. My ex-girlfriend, Julia. We dated for 2 years and I thought we were serious. I was actually planning to propose when she told me she'd been seeing someone else for months. Said she realized she needed more excitement in her life. I'm sorry, I said, understanding now why the documentary assignment felt threatening to him. It's okay, he said. It was a long time ago, but I guess it made me cautious about trusting that someone will stick around. I took his hands in mine, looking directly into his eyes. I'm sticking around, I said, not because I don't have other options, not because I'm waiting for something better to come along, but because I choose this. I choose us, every day. He kissed me then, right there in the middle of the park, and I felt something settle between us that was deeper than attraction or compatibility. It was commitment, real and mutual and freely given. The 6 weeks while David was gone passed more quickly than I'd expected. We talked every night, sharing stories from our days, planning what we'd do when he got back. I used the time to strengthen other relationships I'd neglected, Long dinners with Sarah, weekend trips to visit my parents in Salem, coffee dates with college friends I hadn't seen in months. I also started writing again, something I'd abandoned in college but had always missed. Just personal essays at first, reflections on the past year and how much had changed. But then I started a blog about life in Portland, small observations about the city and its people that seemed to resonate with readers. Nothing earth-shattering, but it felt good to have a creative outlet that was entirely my own. When David came back in late June, tanned and full of stories from the road, I realized I had missed him terribly, but I'd also been perfectly fine on my own. It was a revelation, that I could love someone deeply without losing myself in the process. "You look different," he said, holding me in my kitchen the night he returned. "Happy, really, genuinely happy." "I am," I said. "I think I finally figured out who I am when I'm not trying to be what someone else needs." "And who's that?" I thought about it seriously. "Someone who writes and reads and makes terrible jokes and burns dinner more often than not. Someone who likes quiet mornings and long walks and documentary films about things I'd never thought about before. Someone who loves deeply but doesn't lose herself in the process. I love that person," David said simply. "Good," I said, standing on my toes to kiss him. "Because she's not going anywhere." Looking back on that year, from the afternoon Marcus called us just friends, to the evening David came home from his documentary project, I realized I'd learned something important about love. Real love doesn't require you to shrink yourself or sacrifice your identity, or wait endlessly for someone to see your worth. Real love sees you clearly and chooses you anyway, consistently and without reservation. I never did thank Marcus for breaking my heart that day in the coffee shop, but maybe I should have, because losing him taught me what I deserved, and that led me to someone who was actually capable of giving it.